Hello and thanks for watching. This channel is an adjunct to the Facebook page Pedagogical Memes on Philosophical Themes. In this video, I interviewed Dr. Eric Berg. Dr. Berg is a philosopher who specializes in the thought of Albert Camus. He is well published, he is an active member of several professional societies, he is the book review editor of the Journal of Camus Studies, and he's been a friend of mine since our days in grad school, now over 25 years ago. I hope you enjoy the interview. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Heber, admin of Pedagogical Memes on Philosophical Themes, and this is going to be the first of a series of interviews that we do for the page, in which I bring in people and from different areas of the philosophical world and to ask them some questions. And first up on this list of interviews is my dear friend, Dr. Eric Berg, who has been actively in the area of Camus scholarship for over 2 decades now, and probably as interest about another decade and a half, before that.
Yeah.
And so,
Yep.
welcome to the page, Eric. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your work with the memes too. They are absolutely priceless and they're very clever. And as I always say on my writing assignments, clever is good in my book.
Clever is good. Yes. Well, that is you're part of the core audience. As the page started off with about 24 or so people that were mostly friends and former grad school buddies, and so the idea behind the page initially was just to act as a reservoir, as a resource for people to incorporate them as part of the instructional media, and then it just sort of went on from that. And so I'm always pleased to hear that people actually are incorporating them in classroom use, because I regard that as part of the original charter of the page. So thank you for that. But let's go ahead and get right into the questions. Now, of course, I mentioned in the setup that you're a Camus scholar. So the first question is, did you come to Camus through philosophy, or did you come to philosophy through Camus?
I came to Camus through philosophy. So I did a political science bachelor's degree, and then I added philosophy to that at Morehead State University, or Minnesota State University, Morehead, which had a traditionally well-regarded and well-stocked philosophy program back in the that would have been the mid 90s, late 90s, or early 90s. And from that, one of the readings we did was inside Camus. Particularly, we read The Stranger and we read The Plague, 2 entree novels that are very typical of an approach there. And it might have been the fact that we did more traditionally analytic stuff first in the course and then switch to more continental. If you want to talk about that, those distinctions, they're problematic, but they were certainly prevalent there. And it was just refreshing to read Camus and to understand the arguments that were advanced in the form of great literature too. So it was Camus inside a philosophy course. And then I had the great fortune of being able to buy a new publication by Camus right when I started to find interest in Camus, because The First Man was then translated into English right after that period. So I remember purchasing the book new and consuming it while coming to my first understandings of Camus as an undergraduate. So it was by a very traditional route inside a well-taught introduction to philosophy course that I received my first work on Camus.
Fantastic. So it was just a 100 level sort of survey course, your standard introduction to philosophy. And that was you had, I assume that you were aware of Albert Camus as the literary figure before that, but that was the first sort of awareness of him, that he was taken seriously in philosophical circles, or?
Not really. I was a political science major first, and dabbled between domestic and international politics in political science. And most of my energy then was spent either in the realm of local politics through the 7th District in Minnesota, or international politics, because my advisor was from Sierra Leone. Really interesting man, trained in Soviet Union, got his PhD in Soviet Union, got his JD in Soviet Union, and ended up at the state institution I was at. So I took a great interest in international politics. So the scope of my understanding of philosophy was really Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. That was about it. So Camus was something new on the syllabus to me the first time I opened and did the reading in The Stranger. That was my first introduction to him. Even association with him was right off the start there.
Nice. And so you had that sort of, that entry point. And was there that immediate interest with Camus? This is something I want to pursue further. From that point, you sort of had this, kind of direction once you made that shift from political science to philosophy.
No, I had. So they brought in a faculty member for 1 year at Minnesota State University when I was finishing up the philosophy program there. And I became very close friends with him, Dr. Gerald Potter. He was a Catholic priest and a PhD holder and Jesuit priest. And I became pretty close with Gerald Potter, Dr. Potter. And when I was done, I said I wanted to go on to graduate school. And he said, I'll write you letters of recommendation, but I want you to at least look at one seminary. And I'm like, I don't want to go to seminary. And he said, I think you should look at it. He said, you're Lutheran, right? The best Lutheran seminary is right in St. Paul, Minnesota, or Minneapolis, Minnesota. Go down and at least take a look at that, doing a master's degree there. So I said, fine, you write me letters of recommendation to other schools, and I will at least follow up on that promise that I made, that exchange we made for letters. And I went down to Luther and met James Burtness, who was a Bonhoeffer specialist. And so I became very interested in theology and Bonhoeffer. So my trajectory was initially a PhD or a THD, a Doctor of Theology. And I formed a very close relationship with Jim Burtness, and then at Luther Seminary. And he made a deal with me. He said, when you're done with your master's, your MA, not an MDiv, your MA in theology and doctrine, I will tell you whether I think you have the capability to move on or not. And I will be very honest with you, because I will recommend you move into a PhD or a THD program, or I will recommend that you don't. And when we got done, he said, yes, I think you can do this. In fact, I encourage it. So then I started applying to PhD programs, but my track was still the combination of philosophy and theology. And I selected the University of Kansas, as you know, because I wanted to work with James Wolfel and work primarily on Bonhoeffer or Kierkegaard with Dr. Wolfel at the University of Kansas. So then I rediscovered Camus under Jim Wolfel, under Dr. Wolfel at Kansas. So initially, I was much more vocationally driven about what I wanted to do with the degree, which is usually the opposite. Usually you're a young person, you're a daydreamer, you're just studying philosophy for the love of it. But I felt that, if I worked in this area of Lutheranism, there were opportunities for me there because of the pedigree and etc. And that would open up. And then when I became a little bit more seasoned, I decided to do things that I liked. And that became Camus after that. And Jim Wolfel, of course, wrote a landmark book on Camus, and I took Wolfel's Camus seminar at the University of Kansas, and that was very important for me. And I just touched on this subject yesterday. I just did a Zoom with David Camus, who is Albert Camus' grandson, and we were talking about one of the reasons to write. He's a writer too. And he's an agent for writer and an editor of a lot of French literature. And he translates H.P. Lovecraft into French. That's his latest thing. But he was talking about this. One of the reasons that his grandfather's work is still so popular is that Camus wrote for the most part about what he knew and what he loved, and he stayed in his subject matter. And I definitely agree with that, because there are some times when Camus moves out of his comfort zone and the work isn't very good, but when he stays in that comfort zone, it's very good. So I think those two things sort of lined up for me as I became late master's degree, early PhD. I was going to put more risk into it, which is not a good plan, but I was going to put more risk into it and pursue the things that I felt I really understood and loved, rather than be more vocationally minded. Like if I had really concentrated on ethics, I think a lot of doors would have opened up for me for jobs, rather than have this heavy theology continental background. But it turned out fine in the end. But it's not a course I would recommend.
Yeah.
Even in that environment of 2005, I graduated from the University of Kansas. Even coming out on the market in 2005, that wasn't a good strategy, but it worked out. So, yeah, it was a love of that material that I was shedding away the vocational aspects and the studying for the end of getting a job. I was studying because I loved that material, and I felt I had something to offer inside that world that way. So
I think the two favorite parts of what you just said, there's like, first is like you being cajoled into going to seminary, and
yes,
also with the promise of letting you know if you had a future in that, because I think that's something that's sort of lacking. There's the people are too quick to encourage people to pursue something that they like, something that they're interested in, rather than something which could potentially be viable. And viability, whenever it comes to education in the humanities, you have to take viability into consideration, for that. Yeah, so I appreciate those two remarks there. As I get to the second question here, as I mentioned in the intro, you've been deeply engaged in Camus scholarship for several decades. You're well published, and you've taught several upper level courses on the thought and writings of Camus. As you might imagine, the followers of this page have divided opinions about Camus, some holding him in high regard, others barely recognizing him as a philosopher at all. I'm not going to ask you to defend Camus or to convince others to like him, but since most people's awareness of Camus stops at the 100 level, would you give us some insight as to what an upper level course in Camus looks like? I apologize for that long setup to the question, because as I frequently tell my students, just like the long setup with just like one line of an actual question that has an entire two paragraphs of a setup. I'm notorious for that, and I'm continuing that tradition in these interviews.
Good. It's good tradition, certainly. Just a touch on one thought quick. It is correct that in my experience of teaching, Camus is a very good gateway into students engaging in philosophy. So he does grab 19-year-olds, and he grabs 19-year-olds hard. That doesn't devalue his work as you get on to be more advanced. In fact, I think it's a light that shines on it, the fact that he is so accessible and so understandable by 19-year-olds. So even in an introduction class where you're just going to teach a little bit of Camus, if you teach The Myth, or if you have them read The Stranger or something like that, they do 75% of the students in the course will reflect on Camus in a very positive way that way. So he does grab the youth, but he has certainly viability. So I've been blessed to teach seminars on Camus in several settings at a private liberal arts college in Illinois, McMurray College, which no longer exists. I taught, I think, 4 senior seminars on Camus there, and then I was able to teach one at Bemidji State University in Minnesota at the seminar level. I have them read a great deal of Camus, because he is a quick read. He's not, other than The Rebel, there's not a lot of things that a diligent student needs to look up and dig in a little bit deeper to understand what's on the page. He's going right after it in that way. So
most of his works are sort of solitary, and there's sort of a limited scope that you can sort of understand in the absence of a whole bunch of other background and general awareness.
Exactly. And if you want the web that it hangs in, that's pretty easy to present and pretty easy to find, but you don't need that web, that contextual web, to really understand these pieces. So in a seminar, one of the things I love to do is I have them read The Stranger, and then I have them read Camille Dowd's The Meursault Investigation, which is a fabulous book, despite the book review I wrote in it for the Society. It's a fabulous book that looks at it takes the Arab perspective of the stranger, and it's the brother of the Arab that is killed on the beach, and there's some very, very hard hitting pieces there, and it's directly at Camus. So I have them read The Stranger, and then I don't lecture on it, and then I have them read the Marceau investigation back to back, and then they write book reviews of each, and then we go into at the seminar level. Then we go into the understanding of what's going on with The Stranger and how it's constructed and the traditional interpretations of it. But to just let them read The Stranger for the first time and let a younger person's perspective settle on the book, I learn a tremendous amount in those classes, because you and I come from the same training. It's very traditional. It's very Western, very traditional Western philosophical training. So the frameworks that I bring to The Stranger are very norming, very, very much in that sense. And then the fact that I've read all the secondary literature on The Stranger, I have an awful lot going on in my head about it. But when somebody reads it for the first time, they really bring some really, really good notions to that. So we do that. We read The Plague, we read The Fall, we read a number of short stories with Camus. We read The Myth, we read some from The Rebel, which is difficult. And then we read at least one or two theater pieces. The Misunderstanding, or Cross Purposes, is one of my favorite plays by Camus. He's often not seen as much other than a novelist or a short story writer, but some of his theater is fantastic. I haven't had them read Caligula much, but I've had them read The Just Assassins, again, which is a fabulous piece by Camus. And then we get into the political writings. We read some letters that he wrote for Combat, editorials that he wrote for Combat, which was the French underground newspaper during World War II that he was an editor and contributed about 4 pieces a week to. That's a very tough read if you don't know what you're doing, because some of it is so episodic and so focused on like local French Parisian politics that it's pointless. These people are dead and we don't know who they were. But there's some other really good pieces in there about the political climate post coming out of the war, post-liberation especially. Though some of those pieces that Camus writes about collaboration have much deeper meaning than just what do we do about French collaborators. It has really, really metaphysical meanings there. And then I end up often with this one too. This is new, so I've only been able to use it lately. But Speaking Out, these are Camus' speeches that were published in English in 2022, I believe. And you get things that weren't accessible before. They were accessible only in French. And they're very directed, intentional speeches about certain things. So that has been a real gem. We read some secondary literature. There's some seminal pieces that have been published primarily through the Albert Camus Society that I have them read, that are short and well-written secondary pieces about Camus. And then I have this absolutely... there's 2 things that I take great pride in, 3 things that I take great pride in my Camus seminar, and obviously one of them has just come about recently at the Bemidji state level. So the first one is one of my favorite assignments in the Camus course is have them cast characters for a novel. And if the 20 questions piece that I do on Albert Camus Radio asks for that also. But I'll have my students cast everybody in The Plague, or cast everybody in The Stranger, or cast everybody in The Misunderstanding. And some of the students, and then defend it. They do a PowerPoint for me. They show me who it is, why they picked them, and then the defense of why this person. And some students, of course, follow Camus' description of the characters very closely and try to match up body type and et cetera, and age and et cetera. That's fine. That's good. You get some obvious ones. You get a little bit too much James Dean for Marceau and et cetera. But I'm surprised they still know who that is. But I see that a lot. And then you get some real flexibility. I've had a person that cast, the entire Plague with women, which is very insightful because there's hardly any women in the Plague. And to make those connections. I've had students use video game characters that I have no
Right.
reference point at all, but that's
Mhm.
their world. They go back and they socialize and play around that. And this character's, it's absolutely,
Yeah.
Dr. Ryu and the Plague, and it's fabulous. And then my most the student that did the most with this cast it using musical uh, sections, little pieces of music. He said, "This
Oh.
is what I think represents Dr. Ray, or this represents Penelot." And he explained it really well. And he was, of course, he was studying music and symphony, but he used these snippets of symphonic pieces and able to explain it. So that has been a great assignment, and I think it's an assignment that's really stood the test of time for the upper level students. The second thing that I do in there that I really love is my final exam. I think is a very well written exam, because I say your instructor feels the following way about Camus. I will say Camus is a colonist. He's guilty of being a colonizer. For the following reason, I may or may not believe that, but I take a very strong position. This is
Mhm.
how I feel about Camus. The Arabs are absent in the Plague. The Arab has no name when he's killed in The Stranger, and I give 4 or 5 really solid examples of how they're pushed aside. And I ask them to argue the other side of it.
Mhm.
So I'll claim he's a misogynist, argue the other side of it, that he's not. I claim that he's a colonizer. He represents colonial authority and imperialism in Algeria. Argue the other side of it, and then those are good. Those are really good questions, because at the upper level, they're having to construct a position that they may
Yeah.
not agree with, or I might take the other part. I'll say, despite the criticisms of Camus, I think there is a strong feminist vein in Camus, and I'll come up with 3 or 4 reasons why, and they'll go the other side of that. And then the third, it relates to directly what we were just talking about. I rarely do quizzes, but every once in a while I'll start class with one of your memes about Camus, and I'll say, "Tell me why this is funny."
Mhm.
And they have to explain it, like the
Yeah.
Uno theme, which I love, draw 47 cards or whatever, or take a solid position on
Oh, yeah.
Algeria, and there's Camus with this
Mhm.
fistful of cards.
Yeah.
Why is that
Mhm.
funny? and
Mhm.
and at a certain point they should know why that's funny, if they, God forbid, they don't understand the game, but they have to understand Camus enough to get the humor in
Yeah.
one of the memes that you've created. So those are really three high points of a seminar on Camus. And then another part of it that I think comes with just the blessing of me being inside the Camus Society for many years. I can zoom in experts, and they're always willing to do that. So I zoomed in a woman from Canada who's written a very, very important piece on Meursault. I zoomed a gentleman in from Los Angeles again, who's written a really important piece on Camus, Dr. Peter Francev, on the homosexuality, the possibility of Meursault being homosexual in
Mhm.
the Stranger's really nice. Dr. Balzer-Giray, I zoomed her in. She's the woman from Canada who has this wonderful piece about it has these wonderful distinctions about what exactly uh, the moral standing sort of Meursault in the
She's a
text. So
follower of
by
the page,
able,
by the way. Yeah,
oh
Balzer
yes,
Gray. Yeah,
yes,
she's yeah. Mhm.
yes, yeah, very
Yeah,
much,
I see her on there every once in a while.
gets it. Yeah, and they've been just so generous to zoom. I've zoomed into their classes also, but it's just that that's another blessing, like to have people read her article and have me help them through the article a little bit, and then have her come to class. Boom, there she is on the screen, all the way from Canada, and engaging my students that way. It's just fabulous. So there's an awful lot you can do with Camus, and you can point out his problems too. You can point
Mhm.
out in his work with Kantian ethics that it's a pretty superficial understanding of what's going on there with Kant. He gets Kierkegaard, but he doesn't
Yeah.
really get Kierkegaard. So you can also show that there are some limitations here with his understanding, certainly.
I was doing my best to write down some notes as you were talking, but I missed the
Yeah,
first one. You said that there were the three things that you were happy about with your seminar. The
yeah.
first one, can you repeat what you said for the
I
first
think
one?
the first one was the casting, right? The
Oh, the casting
casting,
question. Yeah, the
yeah, the
question about the
casting.
casting.
Yep. And then the
Yes.
final that I'm proud of, and
Mhm.
then your memes. Those are the three. Yeah, the casting is the first one that I think really works well. Yeah,
Yeah, that was the I was going to go back to the video game reference that you had
yeah,
on that because
mhm,
I have a similar assignment at a 100 level course
yeah,
whenever I'm talking about Kierkegaard and the stages along life's way, and I
yeah,
ask my students to identify somebody from popular
yeah,
culture that's
yeah,
in each of those stages,
yeah.
and the number of video game references that I get that I'm
Yes,
absolutely clueless about, and
no,
it's like,
I
well,
know.
I have no idea who this person is, but you make a very strong case. If the
Yes,
character is as you just
yes,
described, that is one. But of course, I don't
exactly.
know. I don't always take the time to go
No,
back and double
no,
check. I just as
no.
as detailed as some of those student descriptions are, it's like they didn't make that up. That's
I know.
coming from
Yes,
somewhere. Yeah, that was a
exactly. And
great one.
plus,
And
if you do it publicly, like I have them do a PowerPoint, the other
yeah,
students in the room are going to go, they're going to
there's
give
the
looks
group.
at this.
Yes, the
Yes, yeah,
group fact checked. Yeah,
yeah,
and the second one, you sort of the question that you ask on your final examination.
yeah,
You just opened up something for me because I so many times I have students in class that'll ask me my personal opinion about
yeah,
philosophers,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm reluctant to do that because I don't want them crafting responses
yeah,
speaking to my own personal sensitivities, and so I
yeah.
always I lay out the arguments, it's like here's the material, but the way you
Yeah,
framed that, just sort of, giving them a position to sort of,
yeah,
hone in on and to, telling them to go against it. It's like, this is my position, convince
yeah,
me otherwise. Here,
yeah,
here's, I think that's an excellent way of addressing, personal perspectives, whether legitimate or just taken for the
yeah,
sake of that question. I think that's a great way of handling. That's why I applaud you for those questions. That is
yeah.
great.
Thanks. Yeah, they're
And
good.
the
They're fun.
and the meme having students explain
Yeah,
memes, I do the same thing. Now those are
yeah,
extra credit questions on my examinations,
yeah,
but I will, just like I said, because some of those memes, like you have to roll pretty deep on some of
yep,
those to sort of
yep,
get the joke, and
yep,
if you can explain the joke, it's like, well, okay, now you had to already get seven other references in order to get the
yeah,
joke that's embedded
yep,
in that
yep.
meme. So
Yeah, it's a
I'm
great
glad
way to
again.
start
I'm,
class.
I'm glad
Yep,
to see the memes being used for
yep,
something other than just entertainment.
yeah,
Thank you for the very attentive answer to that question. Question number three,
yeah,
and I just a note to anybody, the people that are watching this. I always have to have everything printed off because even though I have the
yeah.
questions open up in the screen in front of me, my eyesight is such that it's just easier for me to read the print version.
Mhm.
So the question number three, if people know one thing about Camus, it's his analysis of Sisyphus. If people know a second thing about Camus, it's his association with Sartre. If people know a third thing about Camus, it is his position on the Algerian War. Famously, Camus was slow to make comments about that war, and when he did take a public position, he managed to displease people on both sides. Even today, his position remains a source of controversy. Had Camus lived to 70 instead of dying at 46, would he have still stood by that position?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a hotly debated question inside Camus studies. Um, First, a few feelings, a few of the way that I understand Camus at that stage. Um, First and foremost, Camus, I think Camus, the facticity of Camus' life plays an enormous role in some of his thinking. And I think for the French Algerian question, I take the following position on for two reasons. Camus was not as bold as many would like him to have been. Number one, he was neither French nor Algerian in the sense of those populations accepting him. So he was born in Algeria, Pierre Noir, poor French colonizer, generation later, but poor French colonizer, Pierre Noir, Black Boot, is what the reference is there. And he was called Black. The people of the French people that Camus was part of the socioeconomic bandwidth that he was in were called Pierre Noir or Black Boot by both sides. Both the French and the Algerians called that group of people Black Boot for two very different reasons, but I think it illuminates Camus' feelings and understanding of his position in Algeria. The French called them Black Boots because they had dirty boots because they worked in the soil. They were laborers. They were of the lower socioeconomic bandwidth in that French system. They weren't bureaucrats. They weren't administrators. They weren't cops. They weren't in that middle management range or above, in the intelligentsia, the doctors, the priests, etc. in Algeria. His family was poor and hard scrape. So it was a derogatory term that he had quickly became identified by from the French, especially in France, but then the upper levels in Algeria, that he was had dirt on his boots, and his family did, because that's where he came from. And then the Algerians adopted the Pierre Noir, the Black Boot moniker for Camus people because it was the boot of authority. It was the police and the military wore black boots, and they put it on your neck to hold you down. So he's neither Algerian because he has the colonial aspect hung on him, and it's facticity, right? He's born there. He wasn't asked to go there, and he didn't voluntarily do this. He's born into this situation. So he's deeply Algerian in his soul, because when you read the short stories and the early writings, the Tapasa short story and the Return to Tapasa, and even The Stranger and the Plague, you get these wonderful, vivid descriptions, loving descriptions of Algeria. And another thing to note is every time Camus moves the story north, the darker it gets and the more critical of human nature it gets. So these stories that take place in North Africa have the sun and illumination that takes place, and that's ourselves too. But as you start to get these stories that are written further and further north, they really take a very disapproving view of European culture, like the plays, The Misunderstanding, and The Just Assassins. The Misunderstanding takes place in Eastern Europe, and it's a terribly bleak play. Nobody survives. There's suicides and murder, interfamily murder and suicides because of it, and duplicity. And it's awful, awful people in The Misunderstanding. I'll just stick with The Misunderstanding rather than saying cross purposes every time. But that's Europe. And then you move to The Fall, which is even worse. The Fall takes place in Amsterdam, and it's dark, and it's misty, and there's clear references to slavery and clear references to Nazism, and the lead character is awful. The Judge Penitent is an awful person that you're dealing with there. So he feels that way about Europe, clearly, but he's French, right? Because he is French. They have a different legal system, both civil and criminal. They have a different economic system, a different religious system, different social system, different educational system. He benefits from all that by being French. So he's that, but he's not. And then when the war breaks out, he moves to Paris and is living there, and it's still dragging around behind him, because he the faculty that in the French system at that time, the faculty that end up teaching in the colonies, you took a test and you ranked 115th out of whatever, and if you were 115th out of 200 or 150, you're going to Algeria, or you're going to another colony probably to teach. So that doesn't mean he didn't have quality education, like Germain, certainly a fabulous writer and very powerful thinker, but by luck, the civil service exam is going to sort, and the general opinion of Camus when he started to run with the circle of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre in Paris was that colonized education is what he has. And he's from there. So there's always this ability to, you didn't go to the left bank, you didn't go to the Sorbonne, it's a pretty good shot that you had mediocre at best training in your field. So, and he feels that, right? And they're vicious to one another. I mean, Camus could be biting and smart and witty and personal, and Sartre could do that to him. Simone de Beauvoir could be that way. So that hung in the atmosphere when Camus became successful. 1942, 43, he becomes successful, and that's still hanging in the air that he's and he's of half Spanish descent, right? So he's swarthy. He has there's some identifiable racism that is lurking way in the background, but it's there. It's a button that can be pushed with Camus in those settings. So when the Algerian crisis unfolds, I understand why he had a difficult time being put in one of the two camps. And when the Algerian crisis unfolds, Camus is famous. And you know this, and I know this, but I'm not sure that everybody that may watch this episode knows this. But, French philosophers in the late 40s and early 50s were, A-list celebrities. They were rock stars. And of course, Simone de Beauvoir was attractive. Camus was very attractive man. Sartre was the other side of the spectrum, but nevertheless, they were.
He was still quite appealing to the younger generation. Yeah, despite his physical, displeasantries. He was still an object of desire for a lot of people.
A lot of people. And there was a magic around them. They came out of the war, and this was the like the second golden age of the cafe philosophers. And so he's also burdened by that, and he's very clear about that, because when he goes into his period when he doesn't write anymore and it emerges from that with the fall, the weight of fame on Camus was tremendous, and it shocked him at times that when he would take a position on something, masses of people would follow that position because his name was attached to that and didn't critically think through it. Now, we're living in an age now where that's the norm. But that was not necessarily the norm at the time, and it surprised him that simply taking a position on the death penalty or nuclear weapons proliferation would sway masses of people in his direction. And that's not his comfort zone, right? Like, foreign policy and nuclear weapons is not his wheelhouse.
And how quickly some of those intellectuals were expected to take, because Sartre, of course, was the opposite end of the spectrum. Like he would form an opinion about something that he hadn't even really fully studied. He would just that sort of whoever was being oppressed, whoever he was automatically on that person's side without even researching it, and then he would fire off an editorial or submit an essay or just whatever it was. He was always very quick to do that. And then you have sort of Camus, who doesn't really like the expectation of that, and sort of surprised whenever people are swayed by what he has to say, and then just that general reluctance to take that model. Whereas Sartre was, it's a duty of the writer, that the writer has to be politically active and to be taking these positions and pushing in a certain direction. And Camus was quite reluctant to take on that kind of banner.
Yeah, he understood the weight. He understood the responsibility, I think, much better. That's the whole thing with the falling out over communism too. It's like it became very, bifurcated. And again, we live in a world now where we see either ors. There's this position, that position, and there's no in between. And he got stuck in that with the idea of communism too. It's like, well, then you're just a raging capitalist if you're not, looking at the communist model. Well, look at Stalin, for God's sakes, is what he's thinking about. It changed there. So I'm not the Soviet model, no, but the idea, yes. And French communism, he had a falling out with the French Communist Party because they had to make a decision in 1937, I think, whether they were going to support the indigenous population or not, and they said no, and he said, I'm out then.
Yeah.
And so that traces all the way back to that, where if you're not representing everybody in this workers' cause, I'm out. I'm for the idea, I'm just not for the idea in this way. So this is one of the reasons I had this. Another reason I had this book out. This is an excellent source. It's called Albert Camus Speaking Out: Lectures and Speeches 37 to 58. But there's a number of speeches in here that are on that particular issue. In fact, the last one is called My Debt to Algeria, lecture at the Algerian Club, 1958. He's got a number of really important pieces on his actual feelings about Algeria that were held in French only until 2022, and when this one came out. So this book changed my view on Camus also. So yeah, so your question was actually if he lived to 70, if he lived into the Sartre de Beauvoir range.
Right. Would he have stood by that reluctance to take a position, and the position he did eventually not fall into, eventually at the position that he did eventually stake out, would he have stuck with it? But we might have to pause here because this meeting is going to time out, and so I'm actually going to have to pause it and do some editing here and then patch it together. So we will pick it up there in a moment. All right, thank you. I apologize for that edit that we had to do. I didn't schedule long enough time for the recording session on Microsoft Teams, but we were ramping up to the answer to the question of just to remind the questions, like, had Camus lived to 70 instead of dying at 46, would he have stood by his position? Specifically the position on Algeria. And before I let you finish your comments, you had mentioned several times, or emphasized several times that Camus was neither French nor Algerian, and it's like, was that a direct parallel to neither a victim nor an executioner? Was that sort of an accidental, fortuitous accident, or were you sort of developing that sort of rejection of dualisms that he had?
I think so. I don't know that it's as present in Camus' thought as it is a fortuitous accident of some of the positions he took and some of the titles that he actually used. So yeah, I think it's lurking back there, but may not have been as present in his mind as it is maybe in later generation scholars, Camus scholars.
Right. So something more like a hidden curriculum. He's not stating it, but it's sort of implied given everything else, all the positions that he was taking. Okay, so after that cliffhanger, what would an older Camus? How would he have assessed the position and the initial reluctance to take the position and the position that he eventually took? Would he have stood by that?
Yeah. So that would put him 1983 when he died. So we'll look at the context of the 60s and 70s into his later life. There is a small blessing, and I hate to say this because some members of the Camus family may eventually see this, but there's a small blessing in Camus dying young, is that we don't have the Wittgenstein thing going on, where we have, what do you mean, the early or the late Camus? Now, what do you mean? For me, there are people in the Camus Society that will say there are stages in Camus, and I it's consistent. His thought is remarkably consistent from 1935 to 1960, 58, 60, right in there. That it is remarkably consistent. It is about the human subject and living in this world and existential philosophy. If he rejects existentialism, that's another argument, but he rejects the title, certainly, of existentialism, but existential philosophy is what he does. So that's the trajectory that we're on, with a very consistent thinker throughout time, and a political thinker throughout time, because one of his very first publications then is on communism, and on one of his very first interests, 35 to 37, is on French communism when he's very young, and French Algerian communism when he's very young. So he's a political person. The death penalty is very important to Camus, and that comes out, of course, in The Stranger, quite well, and it's lurking, I think, in The Plague. Very clearly, it's in The Guest, which is one of my favorite Camus short stories. It's clearly a prominent issue there. So he's carried forward some political themes. So he's not going to be apolitical in the end. One of the interests that Camus was cultivating quite deeply towards the end of his life was Simone Weil. He's responsible for getting Weil published using his muscle at Gallimard Publishing House, etc. And he stopped at Weil's home on his way to accept the Nobel Prize and asked the family for a picture of her, and he carried it with him in his breast pocket when he gave that famous Nobel Prize speech. So he was maturing in 57, 58, 59, 60, 59. He died so early in 60.
Right.
He was certainly maturing between 57 and 60 in taking on the weight of these responsibilities, taking on the notion that he did speak, and he had a responsibility to do that. I honestly I have been having a very hard time trying to map a course on what Camus may have done in the 60s and 70s, and early 80s, then, if he would have lived that long, on the question of Algeria. You have the collapse of the colonies post-war, that he didn't quite see the full collapse there, and the independence. He was deeply hurt by his later rejection by the Algerian population, by the intellectuals and anybody in Algeria, really. He was deeply hurt by that inability to have camaraderie with the folks in Algeria, certainly towards the end. That wouldn't have gotten any better, because it still isn't better. We have a difficult time attracting Algerian scholars to the Camus Society, and I think the Francophone section of the Camus Society, of which I'm not an active member, has a harder time. We've had some, but I think they have a more difficult time attracting Algerian scholars. So his reputation as a political thinker on this is very much divided Europe and North Africa in two different realms that way. It's a terribly, terribly complex question. One thing for sure, I don't think he would have bowed to any political norming pressure. I don't think the French government would have got to him and corralled him into a position that way, nor do I think Algeria could have backed him in such a way by maybe saying, we'll take you back as a brother of the homeland if you would push harder for French or for Algerian independence. He did walk this weird position of coexistence, and it can't. That can't happen. So,
well, I mean, his dream of like the Mediterranean, person, you're a citizen of the Mediterranean. He kind of, like almost like Einstein didn't really understand, like nationalism, or that kind of affiliation. And I think that, Camus, to a certain extent, it's just like, well, we're all part of this, region. Why are we having these weird sort of, alliances and, just sort of, this tribalism, this naturalism, where he just, that idea of a Mediterranean community that sort of existed in his head didn't really exist in anyone else's head, and he couldn't really understand that.
Yeah. And I think he felt the boot of French oppression, as a poor person in Algeria. So he's like, hey, I suffered under him too, so it's like, we're together in this, and I'm of this soil. I was born here, and The First Man, the autobiographical piece that wasn't completely edited at the end, he's reflecting on that. That was supposed to be a 3-volume piece on his upbringing, and he's deeply reflecting on the the biblical narrative of birth in Algeria of him. So you're right on that. The Mediterranean man, the Mediterranean person, is this idealized vision, which he's highly critical of in The Misunderstanding, with Martha's idea of what it's like. So I think he knows a little bit, but he wants something different. So yeah. tough one.
So just to push you on that, would he have stood by
Yeah.
it? He would have stood by it.
Yes, I think he would have stood by it.
Yeah.
I think he would have stood by it. It seems to be a pattern that once well thought out position, not blind to evidence, not blind to change, but I think a well thought out
Yeah.
position would have been consistent there. So yeah, I'll commit to he would have stood by the 57 to 60.
Yeah, certainly, we have the his position on communism to sort of go back there, because he was sort of reluctant. There was that long, it was that rift between him and Sartre. It was building,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it was building because he was sort of reluctant to take a position because he knew what was gonna happen as a result of that. Those two people, they were just so divergent in their as similar as they were in the mind's eye and the public's eye. They knew that they had some deep differences between them, and just once he took that position on communism, he didn't look back. He just sort of he didn't cave to all of those, all of the editorials and all of the essays that Sartre and his friends were levying against him, and sort of seeing Camus as a traitor to communism. It's just he was unmoved. He just is like he didn't randomly take that position. It was well thought out, sort of a tortured decision-making process. But once he was there, that was moving forward. This is my position.
That
so I would be inclined to agree that his stance on Algeria is like, hey, I thought about it. This is my position.
This is my position.
Moving forward. Mm-hmm. All right. So thank you for the very well thought out response to that question. Question number 4. To get a PhD, you need to make a contribution to the discipline, of course, which is the whole idea behind the dissertation. Mm-hmm. Turning that around, what has the discipline given you, both in philosophy in general and Camus in particular?
Yeah. Wow. So this is a very particular question in the academy, because I don't think this question is asked of some other members in other disciplines of the academy, and the expectations that philosophy gives are very high, and they should be very high. They absolutely should be very high. It's given me some of the things it's given to me are some of the things that I try to stress very clearly in my classes. My ethics, all of us make a living teaching ethics, unless you're teaching at a R1 and you can just teach, Kant, and that's it. But the rest of us, we have to teach ethics or social political or logic to stay employed, so then we can do the other things. So I, in turn, was trained well in ethics at KU, and I teach a lot of ethics courses. And I try some of the skills that I think that I've picked up. Some of the benefits of philosophical thinking are some of the things that are right forefront in the syllabus about what I want to give to the students, because I think it's important for them to know why they're in the course. They know why they're in the course because they need a value theory class, but that beyond that, we're doing more than that in this course. And one of the things I talk about is being able to screen out static and screen out noise, be able to assemble the pertinent parts of the information and talk about whether that information is sourced properly and how it bears on a particular question. And when we do case studies in ethics, I will add things to case studies that are neither here nor there for the case. There's not everything in a case study is going to bear on this particular question. So figuring out what the moral question is in a particular case, and screening out some of the stuff that's up there that just it doesn't pertain to it. But Dr. Berg put it in there. Yeah, Dr. Berg put it in there to hope that it's discarded and it's not part of your answer. And that, I think that's so by way of negation. That's one thing that I would hope that philosophy has given me is an ability to screen the static around things. And of course, maybe I'm getting older, maybe I'm getting more cynical, but I spend a great deal of time doing that now with the news and et cetera, trying to figure that out. Another thing that I realized early on is pattern recognition. That has always been something that has been helpful for me. This idea of pattern recognition. When I was studying Kierkegaard, and just so we can limit the number of comments, I do know it's Kierkegaard, but in the American context,
Right.
I'm going to say Kierkegaard, even though I'm, an hour away from the center of Kierkegaard studies in the United States. St. Olaf College is only an hour away from me, and I know it's Kierkegaard, but we're going to say Kierkegaard here. When my study of Kierkegaard with Professor Wolfel and my work in Kierkegaard, I think one of the things that helped me navigate Kierkegaard really well was recognizing Lutheran patterns in Kierkegaard, because I love him dearly, and we're still very close friends, Jim Wolfel, but he wasn't Lutheran, and so he didn't have the ingrained feel for the Lutheran part of Kierkegaard, and that was very helpful for me. This is very clear. This is, these are the confessions. This is Melanchthon. This is Luther here. This is, Luther Volume 6 is where he got this, and more importantly, it's not necessarily Luther's mouth. It's the confessions of the Lutheran Church that have stood the time from Kierkegaard on forward to when I was working in Kierkegaard heavily, that I see the pattern recognitions in that. When I was very, very hot after Heidegger for a while, because Heidegger, with the Protestant Lutheran piece there, the Anfechtung in Heidegger, and the death is the triggering event for Dasein. That's Luther right there. Yeah. Absolutely dead on. That comes from Martin Luther. This idea of we get this deeper understanding when we actually understand death, and it's a triggering mechanism, and it happens at age 6, 5, 10, 11, whenever it happens. There's a change in the being of us that we never come back from, and we have to learn from that. That's Luther right there, and I don't see it prior to Luther, and that's, you find that in Heidegger. So pattern recognition has been very good. I was blessed to be able to take a pretty deep dive into the theater, the academic side of the theater of Camus. There's a very fine scholar in Lyon, France, Virginie Lupo, that I've been able to work with, who studies exclusively the theater in Camus. And one of the things she introduced me to was the blocking aspect of theater, which I knew nothing about, moving characters around on stage. So a script will have, you move to this spot 2 feet off the lamp, or you move 3 feet from the door and pause, and then move to your left, etc. Well, that's in Camus. He moves his characters around the scenes in the Plague and in The Stranger in particular. And so that's a pattern recognition thing. And I think philosophy can help one recognize patterns, certainly. There's the simple things like I've been forced to teach logic a few times, which we know that the university didn't get their money's worth when I taught that, but hopefully I make it up on the back end with some good teaching elsewhere. And an intro, I like teaching the informal fallacies. I think those are really important for daily life. It's pattern recognition. Again, it's like, well, no, these two things don't fit, because I can usually name what the fallacy is, but they don't. You can just feel it. You can feel the abrasiveness of what was just presented to you as an argument, and it's not there. It makes life, and I'm sure you're the same way, it makes life when you're buying a car or anything like that very difficult, because the bullshit detector almost breaks in those situations, and you just have to, keep on task. What's the number here? Not the static, and looking at that. So philosophy in general has certainly given me those skills, I guess, that have come along the way. Now, Camus in particular, there are several philosophers in the Western tradition that I think are exceptional writers, exceptional philosophers. Strike that. They're exceptional philosophers because they're also exceptional writers. And there's very few powerful philosophical figures in the West that have significant volumes of work that are equally respected in literary circles as they are in philosophical circles. And back to your one of the first question, I think, where there's a little bit of hesitation sometimes with Camus, it's probably because he has such fame as a literary person
Yeah.
that it's not seen as this isn't premise, conclusion, counter arguments refuted,
Right.
done and done, we move on. That can be there with Camus, but Kierkegaard, again, is one of those that the literary aspect of Kierkegaard is astonishing. Dostoevsky is another, Plato is another, and Camus is certainly one of those where you get, Camus' work is still amongst the very greatest of the French letters, and that says a lot in the Western tradition, that his work is still respected as amongst the greatest production on the continent. Just for the aspect of The Stranger's an awesome story. The Plague is a great story. Yeah. The play of the Cross Purposes or The Guest, the short story, are just really moving pieces of literature, but there's a point to them too. Mm-hmm. There is an argument embedded in that, and being able to see that then, that one can produce a short story like The Guest and get at two or three very important philosophical arguments and positions in that piece with such beauty and elegance has been able to allow me to understand some of the static and performing arts better. So I have a deeper understanding when I go to an art gallery now, or a deeper understanding when I see a play, because there is this ability to transform timeless, sort of core human concerns through art, and that Camus certainly was the gateway for that. Absolutely.
Yeah, the and the concision also, that he can take a point and he can express it in an elegant way, an interesting way, an informed way that can it has those levels to it. In some of the videos you've done for Albert Camus Radio, where you talk about the fall, especially, it's like when you talk about the structuring, like the hierarchical, there's a philosophical, there's a spiritual, there's a political, it's like all kinds of different layerings, and for him to be in one and the same work, to be weaving, to going back and forth between those different levels, and to just to sort of see that as a student for the first time, it's like it can be like, oh, there's a whole other way, a whole other approach of doing philosophy that you don't necessarily get from some of the more historically prominent figures. And to poach a little bit from our last question, well, from the last question that's coming up, I think that's that the attitude of sort of Camus is like not a philosopher, I think that's softening a little bit now, because you go back to what was the standard encyclopedia philosophy of our generation, the Papin Edwards text. Camus doesn't have his own entry there. He is sort of lumped in with what Papin Edwards called the philosophical novelist. They were loath to consider him a philosopher. And he does have, he's got an MA in philosophy, he studied underneath Jean Grenier. It's like he does have that cred, but it just, especially at the 70 with Papin Edwards, with that heavy analytic bias, that those volumes, those encyclopedic volumes, they were lumping Camus in with Dostoevsky, which Camus would have been fine with, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
He would have been fine, but they were sort of lumping him in with Dostoevsky and de Unamuno. Sort of, it's like, well, he's vaguely philosophical, but he's more of a novelist. I do think that the opinion of him, the general opinion of him, is starting to sort of see a shift from just a literary figure who dabbled in philosophy to a philosopher who was sort of presenting the ideas, within that chosen medium of the novel and the play.
He is certainly, has long historical legs, and the energy around him is still a lot of articles, a lot of books that come out on Camus. Not so many dissertations I see, but there's still a scattering of those, especially in Europe. You see more dissertations. In the UK and Poland has a real resurgence in Camus studies. A great friend of mine, Maciej Kalucha, sort of been instrumental in starting the Camus Society in Poland. And David Camus lives in Poland now, his grandson. So there's great energy in Poland. And I just have to tell one story about the Polish Camus Society. It's fabulous. So they've hosted us 4 times for the annual meeting of the Camus Society. And the first time we met there, Maci, my friend in Poland, in Krakow, had the dean welcome the Camus Society to it. And the dean brought these books over, and they were fairly thick, and they really didn't have covers on them. And what he brought us were CIA published books of the Plague, the Stranger, and the Rebel that had been smuggled in to Poland when it was under Soviet control and disseminated underground, and they've been read hundreds and hundreds of times in Polish and then handed off. And they were, contraband at the time. So they were smuggled in typewriter cases, I think he said, inside the guts of a typewriter, and then distributed. And they had these big, rusty, long staples, 3 of them through there. And that's, to risk one's freedom, to bring philosophy to people, and to choose Camus to do that. There had to be choices made because this is very risky, and we're only going to do so many.
We can only smuggle so many books.
Yeah, there's a committee. You and I live in the world of committees, and there's a committee that had to decide who's up. And there's a huge list, and I don't know who else was on the list, but Camus made that list, being able to bring it and smuggle into Poland at the time. So it does speak really tremendously to the voice that he has. And the ending of The Plague, of course, is just, Camus had an ego. I don't think he had a tremendous ego in the relative position of philosophers. He had a big one, though. And, the end of The Plague says, the infestation is still in there, and it's going to rise again. And he understands this wasn't a novel about World War II. It had parallel to that, but the infestation is going to rise again. So the arguments of solidarity with the other humans in The Plague, Camus understood needed to be projected into the future. That this is why this is important. This understanding of solidarity in a time of crisis with other humans is what the key to this is. The key to living is solidarity in that text, and he knew that it was going to carry forward as a timeless piece that way, I think.
Right. And that those comments, like I said, they roll right into this last question here, talking about the future. I'm going to close the interview by asking you for some prognostications. What will philosophy programs, both graduate and undergraduate, look like in 15 years? And what will Camus studies look like in 15 years?
Yeah. So age now, the old guy now in some areas. I imagine you see the same things that I do. You see people being congratulated on their dissertation defense, and it's a Zoom screenshot.
Yep.
There's something about walking into that room physically with some paper notes and a pen and a few books that you're never going to open, but you feel more comfortable having them on the desk in front of you, and sitting down across from those old hands that know the business, they know what you've written, and engaging with them in a conversation in a face-to-face setting that has gone away, I think, for the most part. We get to do things like this because of Zoom. Yeah. My office hours are fabulous now because of Zoom, because students just didn't come.
Yeah.
They just didn't come. And as soon as COVID hit and I put my office hours online and I retained it after COVID, they pop in and I can screen share with them, and they're much more comfortable conversing with me about a class over Zoom than in the office. And I get that. So there's good things that came from that, but you are losing something by not engaging that way. And there's a practical aspect you're losing too, because the next stage you're going to start presenting in front of a bunch of people that are looking for blood in the water. In conferences. Now, the Camus Society is great, but of course I've been in there a long time, and and I feel confident in the things I'm presenting. But you can go to conferences sometimes where there's people that are looking for blood in the water, and you have to be ready for that. And
Mhm.
that's a face-to-face confrontation. It's a body language thing. It's the whole thing there. So
To interject there, I think that there's something that people outside of academia don't fully realize is how competitive it is. I mean, this is
yes,
their sporting event. Those kind of
it is.
conferences, the
Yep.
whatever, what academics might lack in terms of competitiveness, in terms of sports, they direct all of that to papers and and to
Yep.
conferences, and
They do.
like I said, just they can be abrasive,
Yes.
whenever they come to ask a question or
Yep.
to push a point.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it is the like I said, without that sort of real world testing of in a room with somebody, it's like you can lose a step.
You do. I think, yeah, you can be caught off guard, and
Yeah,
that can be catastrophic for your self-confidence. You may not want a conference again.
yeah,
You may present very, very lukewarm material. If it gets presented, if it gets accepted to be presented, you may have a very, very easily defended or very lukewarm sort of proposal because you've been traumatized by getting beat up. And you and I sat in graduate classes at KU, and I'm very thankful that we did, where they were tough on us at times.
yeah,
They would push you and, yeah, show you were wrong or you didn't understand this particular passage. And it wasn't personal. It was just, this is where you're cutting your teeth in this particular fashion, and,
yeah.
and
That
when I
fear of
didn't,
looking unprepared in front of your peers
yeah,
is a tremendous
exactly.
motivator. Yeah.
It is a huge motivator, and when I walked into my dissertation defense, Professor Wolfel said, I have held two things back from our conversations. They're not going to catch you terribly off guard, but, I want to have these conversations with you in front of other people, so, he was ready, and they were all ready to push in certain areas. So the convenience of Zoom and Teams has added to the discipline. I hate philosophy conferences that are on Zoom. It burns my whole Saturday, and I pay very little attention to the
Right.
other papers. And I'm always, I can throw a little laundry in, because I can, and so I love the face to face. That's, I think, sliding a little bit, and very. I think it's something that's missing in the curriculum, and I don't know that it'll come back. The second thing is, I think there needs to be a really very clear landscape drawn for what we're doing in philosophy. I taught for 15 years at a private college that was 174 years old, and it closed.
Mhm.
That's just it. We were March 27th. We were told June 1st we're done. That's it. The model that almost all colleges are built on is an economic model of expansion. You've got to have that 7% enrollment increase to pay the bills, and there's just not the population out there. And then you get
Yeah.
yourself in a really bad position financially and morally. You're accepting students that didn't really want to go or shouldn't be there. They're not ready. You start taking quantity over quality, and you start discounting the tuition, and it just, because you've got to grow, and then you lose the battle of, like, well, not every one of our dorms has a climbing wall, but they
Yeah.
do, and this one has its own weight room and workout area, and this one has gender divided workout rooms. So and we don't, and so students start siphoning off for those reasons, which are not the core reasons. But the tradition that I spent most of my time in, which was a high end private liberal arts college, very super traditional. There's only so many seats at the table for that, and unfortunately, it has everything to do with endowment. So St. Olaf College is going to survive. Grinnell is going to survive, but there are colleges out there that don't have the margin to survive,
Right.
and the liberal arts colleges are going to shrink. And their mission, fortunately, after the growing pains, is going to go back to what liberal arts colleges do now. They're going to certainly train people for good jobs, but they're going to train people that want to go and have a pretty thorough understanding of Plato and understanding of Aristotle, understanding of Shakespeare, They're going to understand art. They're going to engage in some sort of artistic activity there, be it choir, theater, static arts, something. And that's the product that they're going to produce. The bad side of this is it's going to be the wealthy that are going to be producing those kind of citizens, are going to generally come out of those places. The rest will shake out in the form of what the publics want to do. And the publics are driven now almost exclusively vocationally driven. Yeah. So philosophy programs have to, you have to swallow a lot of pride at anything below a tier 1 R1 research institution. You have to swallow a lot of pride. One of the ways that I think are very helpful for philosophy departments to survive is to make connections with other disciplines. And it can be hard, but one of the ways that I was able to keep a philosophy program afloat at a small liberal arts college was I first approached the business department and said, hey, what about a business ethics course? They're like, yes, absolutely. Accounting, same thing. We want a business ethics course. So I designed a business ethics course, which, my favorite, but I got it on their books as a desired elective.
Yeah.
And then it became an elective. And then it got built into their required curriculum that every business and accounting major there had to take business ethics course, and they wanted a philosopher teaching. So that got me one course every year, chock full. Then nursing, same thing. What about a medical ethics course? Yes, we teach medical ethics here, but we'd rather have a philosopher teach it. And that moved from desired elective into the RN to BSN program required. Yeah. So that gave me 2 classes that I knew was going to fill, and it worked out really well that way. It also put people in the room defending me when I wasn't present. So if there were notions of, why do we have a philosophy program? Why do we have a religion program? Why do we have a theater program? Nursing would be, no, we don't want to teach ethics, and he's doing it. So they had a lot of power, and they would be able to push and say, no, we need to keep it. At least if they don't have the major, him or the philosophy professor. And business would be the same way, and accounting would be the same way. They would be present in those defense. Now you're swallowing pride, you're deferring to somebody else to fight your battle and et cetera. But it is a way to keep philosophy alive. And a lot of programs need to eliminate the traditional curriculum. My last post was at a public institution that I love dearly, Bemidji State University. It enrolled 5,000 students. I honestly think that if a student really wants to go on and get a PhD in philosophy, they need to come to the Twin Cities and go to the University of Minnesota, where they have 23 professors on staff, and they get the whole thing, because and they're geared for that. They're training those people to get the masters and the PhD, etc. Where we can't quite do that, and I don't think a mission with a lot of those mid-range publics or privates, but mostly mid-range publics, should be that. I think the room for philosophy programs to survive and do what they want to do is really embrace pre-law. The data's there, and provosts and deans love data, and they should. That philosophy students perform exceptionally well in the LSAT, if not the best. It also gives you a lot of there's some hidden benefits of becoming the pre-law piece, philosophy becoming the pre-law piece. Admissions people understand it. Admissions people it's very hard for admissions people to explain why you should get a philosophy degree, because quite frankly, it's hard for me to explain why you should get a philosophy degree. But not when it's pre-law track. And the parents are like, yes, lawyer, bingo. Awesome.
It gets the parents on board. It gets the checkbooks on board.
Exactly. And it gives direction to your program. You're going to learn Aristotle, you're going to learn Plato, you're going to learn ethics, you're going to learn Kant, but you're going to, this is grooming you for the next step. And plus, it gives the other really important aspect of a university a connection with you, and that's institutional advancement, because they understand that most graduates are more loyal to their bachelor's than they are to their JD school. And those typically become high earners later. So this is a nice delayed reaction that 20 years down the road, they look back at the bachelor's
nostalgia
say,
for their alma mater.
Nostalgia for the alma mater, and that's where the money flows. And so you get that both ends, because if you're just producing PhDs or intended PhDs in philosophy that will teach, you just don't have that backflow from institutional advancement, and it's hard to get the inflow from the admissions people, because we're not doing the admitting, we're not out recruiting, and it's really easy to sit down and talk about why you should be a nurse, why you should be a social worker, why you should take psychology, why you should be fish and game management. It's very difficult to talk about why you should be a philosophy major, but not when it's connected to pre-law. So it's not a sellout, but I think it's an important piece of the future of philosophy. Artificial intelligence is going to be something that is very difficult. I see condensed. I've seen artificial intelligence condense my own papers that I've written into paragraphs, and it's good and it's
pretty
right.
Good. I've done the same
I wrote
thing.
it. Yeah, and it's good and it's right. And so graduate school is very tough. There are ways to cut corners. Some authors say everything in the first 2 pages, and the last 2, you get to know that. Sometimes it's a gamble, but I don't know what'll happen with that, with the ability to condense chapter 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics to this and actually catch it, and the writing. There's some part of me that says AI can be a very good starting place. I've never used it, but if you enter in a bunch of ideas maybe about Camus and Algeria and this, that, and the other, you don't necessarily use the paper that AI wrote, but it can put you in a direction maybe of something that you write. Yeah. So there's that aspect of it also, which is, I think, very, very challenging for scholarship in the future, how much human creativity will go into that. It's, as a editor of a journal on Camus, we've had to have those very hard discussions about how we're ever going to know if something was AI generated or not that was submitted to us.
Because there is no definitive way of proving it. It's like there are. This is highly suspect, but we can't actually say with a total degree of certainty that you would want for that. Because it's somebody's career potentially. It's like the difference between being published and not published, and it's you want to be sure if you're going to be saying no to something. To your I 100% agree with what you were saying about the legacy institutions. I think they're going to remain unchanged going forward. I think that changes to philosophy departments at both the graduate and the undergraduate level are going to remain the same at your legacy institutions. And by the time you get down to smaller state schools, as you were saying, it's like start looking to combine with other, either combine with other departments or at least work with them, be eager to work with them, in order to have those those associations and those collaborations that exist between them. Sort of from my position now, reflecting back on our experience in grad school, just the Don Marquis, our beloved Don Marquis, it seems like he would almost, at the beginning of the year, he would make a pitch for disbanding the graduate department at KU. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And at the time, I found it offensive, and he would bring in like all these statistics from like Ohio State. It is a PhD machine. It's like, it is capable of filling every job opening that is published at JFB.
Yeah.
And of course, nobody took his arguments seriously in terms of like, why are we going to disband our own department? But I sort of like looking back now, it's like that would be good for the discipline. It wouldn't be an immediate payoff for it, and not specifically KU, but there are a lot of departments that have a graduate program in philosophy just because they like saying they have a graduate program in philosophy. And your aforementioned, the field being diluted. You're getting people that, if if philosophy departments were disciplined and started,
Yeah.
we're going to take 4 graduate students a
Yep.
year instead of 8,
Yep.
you're going to get a higher quality of graduate student. But as it is, just like you have at Missouri State where I adjunct, the last full-time job opening that we posted, we had 288 applications for it.
288.
And that's at Missouri State, a
Yes.
small, it's a regional state school. And
Yep.
about a third of those applications were from those tier 1,
Yeah.
legacy institutions. And
Yep.
people that graduated from a larger state school, they didn't even get looked at. They just got pushed aside, because if Missouri State can hire somebody with a PhD from Cambridge, with a PhD from Yale, that's what they're going to do, and that's where the market is, because there's just so many. So the more distance I get from grad school, the more sympathetic I am to Don Marcos's suggestions, like we should just disband, we should shut it down. But of course, nobody wanted to do that because the graduate faculty, they benefited from having the graduate program there.
Yep. And at some point, somebody benefited from launching it, because that was a tremendous boost to their career, with the provost, the president, and deans at KU, when that started, or other institutions that started up. There was some energy behind that. And, and another idea is, if you could shuffle the landscape radically, you'd have areas of expertise. Like if you're going to do Kant, you're going to the University of Texas or NYU.
Yes.
That's where all the Kant scholars are. If you're going to do Hume, UCal or Harvard, and that's where they concentrate, and you'd know what you're getting out of those institutions that way, rather than a smattering.
Yeah. So with that comment, let's go to the specific question. What are Camus studies going to look like in 15 years?
So great question. Timely question. Jim Woelfel, University of Kansas. This book is 50 years old this year. So his book, Camus, A Theological Perspective, turns 50 this year. And for my presentation at the Camus Society in 2025 at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, I'm going to do a retrospect on this book written by Jim, which is a landmark book, 1975 book on Camus. But the paper, the presentation, I'm not sure this lends itself to being a paper, but maybe, we'll see. The paper is also going to talk about waves of Camus scholarship. And I'm very interested in that, because there's the first wave of Camus scholarship, which I'll put some rough dates on this as I figure it out, but I'm probably ending it at 1960. There's the wave when he's still alive, Merton and Sartre and et cetera, those people that commented on Camus' work when he was still alive. And then there's a tremendous wave when he dies. So post 1960 into the late 60s, early 70s, you get that second wave of Camus scholarship. Jim would be in the third wave, 70s, 80s, etc., into the 90s. The resurgence of the first man brings about another Camus renaissance. And you get, that fourth wave, probably 90s, 2000s. And I'm sort of cresting that. I came out of the fourth wave energy, but I'm probably in the fifth wave. And as I look at my very dear friends in the Camus Society, I'm very close with 10 of them probably. We're all of this generation. And because we've been friends so long, you can track our friendship and see that we're a wave of Camus studies that is cresting. Yeah. Because now we're talking about how are the grandkids. Our Christmas gathering on the internet, on Zoom, there's lots of grandchild talk as opposed to child talk. And so now we're realizing that, there's some of us are in their 70s and early 80s. I'm in my late 50s. There's people in their late 40s, but there's a wave coming behind us. And you start to feel the responsibility of how you're interpreting Camus, because you've produced, 15, 20 articles, 10 of those very important articles about Camus, that they're reading, and their understanding of Camus is coming through this. I had a nice conversation with Professor Wolf. It's just hard for me to call him Jim.
Yeah.
Professor Wolfel, about, you know, that his generation and the influence it had on me, and the book that it had, and his Camus course, and how that has influenced me. And now I'm producing work on Camus, and there's this generational connection. So there is a wave coming behind us, and it has some common marks of what one would expect when I see junior faculty applying to present at the Camus Society, or reviewing books. Very interested in colonialism, very interested in indigenous populations, very interested in gender, in Camus studies, etc., which is great. That's the way it's going to unfold. But yeah, but this is a existential moment, certainly for the Camus Society, because we realize that I don't know how many papers I have left in me. There's some dear friends that are 15 years older than me. They're retiring. I don't know how many papers they have. The younger crowd, you know, in their 40s still, which still sort of belong to this wave, because we have a common understanding of Camus because of our training and of our
having gone
interactions
through those echelons at the same time.
And having these new, like the Camille Dowd piece really shook up everything in The Stranger when Camille Dowd produced the Merceau investigation. So we went through that together. We all read that book a day after we got our hands on it, which was a day after it was published, you know. And so we have that mark where the Dowd book is going to be something that this next generation will read, but not with extreme urgency like we did. It's part of the literature of Camus. So I think you're going to see a lot of really, like, there's questions that are very hard for me to answer. Like when I talked about my final exam, I think you're going to find a lot of very good questions answered by this next wave of Camus scholars about how do we characterize Camus' treatment of the indigenous population in Algeria? He's remarked about it. He said, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. If I speak about them, I speak as a colonizer, and I use my voice as a Frenchman to express Arab sentiments in the plague. If I don't, then I act like it never happened to them, and it did. So, you know, he is in a tough spot. So I think there will be very good work done to untie his exact position with the indigenous population. His relationship with women, my generation, for the most part, sees it as awful, just awful. But that's not, I don't have the training to really use a lens to see everything in that perspective. So there'll be other really good scholars coming along, talking about issues of gender and issues of sex in Camus, and issues of colonialism and imperialism in Camus, and things that I can't even really think about probably. That would be
as to what's going to be important for the incoming generation of scholars.
Exactly. What's going to be cast aside and what isn't. One of my articles that gets by far the most citations and the most use in the classroom is a piece I wrote about the two sermons in the plague by Father Panlo, an analysis of those. You know, in 15 years, it may be an afterthought. You know, right now it's heavily used, but in 15 years, it may not be, you know. So you just don't know where that's going to go, but it is exciting, and it is a little hard to swallow that our, you know, we're peaking right now. This is probably, you're going to find my generation, this is probably the best Camus work we'll do, because production will fall off eventually, and you know, etc. But it's interesting to see those waves coming. I don't know. I think gender and colonial issues are going to be very important in understanding Camus. But there's things like the digital humanities that may really root around in there and find some things that, you know, it changed biblical scholarship. You know, the idea of digitizing the text and being able to find language patterns and things inside the Bible that we never knew existed, or in the Gospels that we never knew existed. The same thing could happen with a sharp analysis of Camus in the French. I don't think there'll be anything. The archives have been pretty well exhausted as far as that goes, but you know, there could be some research that's unearthed that way. Letters that he wrote that maybe that were dispersed elsewhere and we haven't seen yet could be a remarkable thing. But it's exciting, certainly.
Yeah, and that's got to feel good professionally to be not just a part of you and your cohorts,
Yeah.
having not just been a part of Camus studies, but to actively help sort of shape it. And then there's going to be this inevitable, passing
There
that
is.
torch in terms of, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's like, the young scholars now sort of
Yeah.
having already sort of, studied, those influential, essays that are in the field, and sort of possibly going in a different, different
Yes.
direction, from
Yep.
them. So yeah, it's got to be satisfying, and also sort of revitalizing to a certain
Yes.
extent. I mean, you
Yep.
mentioned that there's some people that are slowing down, thinking about retiring, but
Yeah.
you're 57, it's just like
Yeah.
you got a lot more scholarship left in you,
Yeah.
and so to
Yep.
have that, to have maybe some of those new eyes, or if
Yep.
you're just looking at Camus through a slightly different
Yeah.
perspective, different generational, lenses and demographic lenses,
Yeah.
could definitely lead to some,
Yeah.
advancements, sort of, making it both wider and deeper, in terms of, what's available for Camus studies. So I'm glad to hear that you're so, optimistic about that.
Yeah. And you get like geographical pieces too. You get really, really important scholars that pop up in particular areas.
Mhm.
And culturally, they influence. Like I mentioned Maci in Poland. There's a very vibrant Camus society in Poland. Simon Lee, who I've not mentioned yet, from the UK, from London. Nietzsche, Camus scholar, and the connections there are extraordinarily deep. And he has the capability, the bandwidth in his head to be able to
Mhm.
hold be a Nietzsche scholar and a Camus scholar at the same time, and be a respectable one. And I haven't mentioned him yet, and I really should, because there have been papers that Simon has given at the Camus Society that I think about to this very day.
Mhm.
The presentation itself, the exceptional insight into Camus. And there's, that just happened to pop up in London. Again, facticity.
Yeah.
That happens to be
Mhm.
when and where he was born. Maci, where and when he was born in Poland. Kim, when and where she's born in Canada. Peter in Los Angeles. And I don't want to make the list here because people
Right.
will
Oh.
drop up with George Heffernan in
Mhm.
Boston, of course. They influence in those areas. So you have the British view and the Polish view and the Canadian view and American scholars. So that mixes it up, because maybe that won't be. Maybe it'll, maybe South American authors will take up Camus, and that'll be a resurgence, because you see a lot of South American work on Kierkegaard now. And that, it's a neat aspect of it, the geographical parsing out of where this energy can be is
Yeah.
neat. Yeah.
Well, our time is running out here, so we're gonna have to bring
Yes.
this to a close. But
Absolutely.
thank you so
Yeah.
much for being generous with your time. It was
Thank you.
it was great to having the opportunity to chat with you. Thank you for taking part in the page. Once again, this is Dr. Eric Berg, at the book review editor. Is that your title
Yep.
at the
Yep.
at
Book
so
review
the book
editor.
review editor at the Journal of Camus Studies?
Got it. Yep.
Okay, all right,
Yep.
fantastic.
That's it.
Again, thank you so much, and thank you for all the viewers that are that watched along with us, and I hope to bring you more of these kind of interviews in the future. But for right now, we'll bring it to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
All right, bye.